All right. Thanks, Joe. And thanks everybody out there for attending. So today we are going to be talking about a project that Bobby and I have been spending a lot of time on lately, trying to understand interactions between fish and aquatic plants. So if I can kind of advance my slide here, here we go. Um, so I'm going to be talking kind of about the project in general, kind of what the goals are, how we set it up, and then I'll be talking about some work we did to do some workshops and outreach to really understand what are the kind of research priorities, knowledge gaps, and other issues facing kind of aquatic plant management and fisheries management in the upper Midwest. And I'll give you a little bit of a taste of the results from a lot of the outreach work we did at the beginning of this project. And then Bobby is going to be talking about us, the kind of initial analysis on this project where we've been looking at how aquatic plants and walleye are interacting across Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Um, so the first thing I always like to point out is that, if you ask people, are plants important for fish? You'll generally get the answer, yeah, of course they are, right? I like to use this example. This is actually a book I read to my daughter. I have a 3-year-old daughter called This Is Not My Hat by John Clausen. And it's all about this little fish that steals a hat from a big fish. And where does the little fish run when it wants to hide? It runs to the plants, right? Where the plants are big and tall and close together. So I think, like I said, in general, we have this sense that, yeah, aquatic plants are important for fish and whether they're habitat or providing food resources or whatever else. If you change aquatic plants, you can expect to see changes in the fish populations that are depending on them. And then despite that connection that I think a lot of people will kind of logically make, what we find as we kind of surveyed across the upper Midwest is that often when we think about fisheries management and aquatic plant management, those are kind of siloed. They are done in different ways. They're done by different people that may or may not actually talk to each other that often. They're done for different reasons, right? So I think there's a disconnect often between aquatic plant management and fisheries management in a lot of our temperate lakes here in the upper Midwest. And that can become a real issue, right? If you think that how you change aquatic plants can influence your fisheries and maybe vice versa, if you're doing both of those in kind of a vacuum and not thinking about the impacts one can have on another, that can lead to some pretty serious unintended consequences. So, for example, you may go out and decide you have a pretty kind of plant-filled lake. Maybe you want to clear off the plants because you want a clean beach, or you're getting some stakeholder concerns about having too many aquatic plants on the shore or whatever. So, because of that, you decide to go in and do some sort of large-scale treatment or herbicide or manual removal or whatever. So now, great, you have a nice clean beach. You're not going to step on any plants as you walk in the water. But then you realize this unintended consequences. Well, now where are all the fish, right? So you may see these things that occur where we're doing plant management that has downstream effects on fisheries and fish populations that you're not really intending, and you may be actually altering your fish populations because of the way we're altering their habitat in terms of plants. Uh, so what we decided kind of as a group, which I'll introduce a group here on the next slide, is that we really need to start thinking about this in terms of kind of terrestrial habitat ecology, right? We need a habitat toolbox for aquatic ecosystems. And I like to bring up the terrestrial work because in terrestrial systems, we do a ton of habitat work, right? That's how we manage our terrestrial ecosystems in very robust and real ways, right? Whether that's doing things like prescribed burns on prairies or collecting seeds and planting plants, cutting trees, planting new trees, doing all kinds of different things. We're constantly changing the habitat, the plant life, the habitat in terrestrial ecosystems. And the question becomes, well, how can we take some of these principles of terrestrial habitat ecology and use them to start developing this habitat toolbox for aquatic ecosystems? In particular, can we start thinking about ways to manage aquatic plants that might redound to some benefits in fisheries or vice versa? So as a group, and here's our group, came up with this project that we got funded by MGLP a couple of years ago now, where we were all sitting around together at a science and data team meeting a few years ago and realized that we had all this amazing plant data and all this amazing fisheries data, and we should really try and figure out how to put these things together and start to ask these questions about how do we develop this habitat toolbox for fisheries and plant management? How do we start thinking about lakes more holistically when it comes to that physical kind of aquatic habitat the plants can provide? So as you can see, this became a really massive collaborative project. It's been a lot of fun, and just kind of give you a sense of where we're covering Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We have collaborators from UW-Madison, which is where I'm based, Wisconsin DNR, Minnesota DNR, University of Minnesota, Michigan State University. Michigan DNR is in there. This list has actually grown over the life of the project. We've started to get also some tribal collaborators as well. And the cool thing about this project that I like to point out is if you see down here on the bottom, we actually got additional funding from specific lake associations. So this is direct public input into funding research, which I think is a really cool and exciting way to show kind of how important and how excited people got about these ideas as we started to develop the project. So the idea behind the project, as I said, was, on its face, kind of simple, right? We have collaborators from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And we know we go out and we collect all of this aquatic plant data and all of this fish data from all these three states. For example, the DNR is going out and doing regular annual surveys of both things. So let's scrape all that data together, put it in a big pile, crank it through some sort of cleaning practice, right? Match it all up, get it harmonized. Figure out what other important covariates you need to have. Maybe it's water clarity, temperature, water chemistry, other things, land use, and do some analysis and hopefully come out with some pretty cool results, right? So let's start to use all these data to come up with this toolbox that we need to have. And what we realized pretty quickly is, well, the first thing we need to figure out is what are the important things that we need to keep in mind? What are the really big important questions that folks have that can inform how we manage our lakes? What are the important variables that we need to develop to be able to kind of develop these more applicable and applied research outcomes? Because when you think about it, these data are incredibly rich and incredibly complicated. So the data we're using, the plant data we're using, are these point intercept surveys. So this is where you're actually laying out a grid across an entire lake. And at each one of these grid points, this is a grid, for example, you're doing a rake pull, right? And this is how we're doing these plant surveys. You're pulling up that rake and you're kind of counting the number of species that are on those plants. And you're maybe determining the rake fullness, an idea of the kind of plant biomass. And if you imagine it, right, think of the amount of data that's on that one rake, right? All this plant data is on one rake pull. And then you're doing a bunch of rake pulls across an entire lake. So you can think immediately of how complicated and how many different ways you could analyze those plant data just because the data is so rich. On the same side, we also can think about a lot of different potential interactions between plants and fish, right? Maybe there are different types of plant variables. Maybe it's structure, maybe it's number of species, maybe it's height, maybe it's biovolume, right? Same thing. All these different fish species are probably interacting with plants in different ways as well. So we have a really complex system here with lots of possible questions. How do we figure out what we actually want to ask and address in this project? So what we decided to do was actually do a community engaged process to figure out what are the questions that we should be pursuing, right? We have all this data. What are the things that people really care about and what do they really want to try and understand? So we wanted our research findings, right, to address these stakeholder concerns and inform management decisions. We wanted this project to have some sort of applicable applied outcome that can really help us start to develop that habitat toolbox. And to do that, we need to start thinking about ways to address community priorities, guide that research question development, and ideally, we can use that process to also start building relationships with managers and other stakeholders, right? We want to keep folks involved throughout the process to make sure we're kind of headed in the right direction as we continue to do this research. So we ended up developing this community engaged process. We identified three major stakeholder groups. And this is these kind of workshops that I mentioned before that I'll be talking about for the rest of my time here. Where we're trying to figure out who do we need to be talking to, who's making those decisions, who are the folks that are thinking about those big research priorities that we should address, and who might be most likely to use the kind of research outcomes that we might produce from this project. So what we landed on was kind of three major stakeholder groups that we wanted to make sure that we talked to. The first one was state agency and academia. These are your kind of researchers, lake biologists, fisheries biologists, plant biologists, folks that are either doing research or on the ground doing the kind of outreach and lake management, and could be using our results to think about decisions in terms of how to manage their lakes. The second group that we wanted to make sure we talked to were tribal and intertribal agency partners. So that'd be the tribal natural resource agencies, or intertribal natural resource agencies. So up here in the upper Midwest, we have GLFWC, for example, which is the Great Lakes, Great Lakes Fish and GLFWC, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Sorry, totally blanked on that for a second. So we wanted to make sure you're getting input from the tribes and their kind of stakeholders and their agency representatives to ensure that we're accounting for their interests and their research needs in terms of a plant management in the upper Midwest. And the third group that we wanted to talk to were local decision makers. Think of this as kind of lake landowners, lake associations, other folks that are kind of maybe a little bit more public facing, but still making decisions about what do they want to do on their lake, and they're often kind of working on a much more local scale. So we wanted to make sure we talked to these three groups. So how do we do that? We landed on kind of these really big ideas of workshops. So we wanted to get a whole bunch of people in a room essentially and have them talk to us about what do you care about, what do you need to know, what things might be most useful, right? So for state and tribal agencies, we're talking to folks across the entire upper Midwest. So we opted for a virtual option. So just like today, everybody's here virtually. We had some virtual Zoom workshops. And I just wanted to quickly highlight that we use this platform called Miro to do this. For folks that have done workshops online in the past, they could be kind of a drag, right? But this Miro tool, it's an online kind of big whiteboard building tool, became really useful for us because it allowed us to develop where everybody could be online in the same place, sharing ideas, writing out sticky notes, looking at the same things. And I think it really helped us gather a lot of amazing information, even though we were in that virtual setting with fairly large audiences of people. And for local decision makers, we went, right to the source. We went to Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers conference and held a workshop there to talk to folks and get their ideas here. So there's me. There's Allie McCulloch, another research collaborator, talking to folks, gathering ideas. You can see all these sticky notes behind us about what folks there are most concerned about when it comes to aquatic plant and fish relationships. So at each of these workshops, whether it was virtual or whether it was in person, we got kind of asked three major sets of questions. The first one is, what are your concerns related to fish or plant management? What do you care about? What do you think about? The second one was, what are your hypotheses about fish and plant relationships? So do you have specific ideas about how plants or plant species and fish species are interacting? Or what are your particular specific kind of research questions that you'd want us to address, given what you know about the data? So at the start of every one of these workshops, we would give them a spiel about the data and the things we could possibly do. And the third thing was, what are deliverables that would be relevant to you, right? Is it some sort of data viewer? Is it some sort of platform for making management decisions? How can we make sure we're delivering data and information that would be relevant to the decisions that you're trying to make on a kind of day-to-day basis? This is just kind of an example. Often we would do this in times kind of breakouts and have people write things down on sticky notes or have different ideas, and then come together and we do some sort of kind of a high-level prioritization or grouping. And then at the end, we'd have people vote. So we had a really nice way of getting a ton of information and then having people start to kind of put it in a hierarchical structure so we could figure out kind of what ideas are floating to the top, what ideas are getting the most votes across all these different topics that might come up. So like I said, we did this for 3 workshops. Some of you out there in Zoom land might have participated in one of these workshops. And if you did, I really appreciate you joining us for half a day. These were long workshops, and we took our time. They also took a lot of time to develop. But as I said, I think we got some really great information out of them. So across the 3 workshops, we had 86 total participants. And we generated 549 different ideas. So you can imagine how amazing these conversations were, talking to all these folks and having this, at the end of the day, having 549 ideas to parse through. So we had, this is an example of one of our kind of sticky note whiteboards where people are putting up their hypotheses about things. And you can see we've started to kind of group them a little bit. But this is just one whiteboard out of a whole bunch of whiteboards. So you can imagine 549 sticky notes, essentially, with different ideas on it. And how do we go through and organize that? One of the first ways we try to do it is we try to do this kind of alluvial chart. So this is taking kind of words that were kind of more often grouped together, or ideas that were more often grouped together. So each of those boxes is a word. and that's then linked to other words that were came up together more often. The point of this is to scare you, right? This is our first shot at it. If you stare at it a little while, it probably makes you pretty dizzy. But this is the idea that we have lots of different ideas, but also lots of different ideas that are connected to each other in different ways. So the last little bit of this talk is how do we kind of start pulling this stuff apart and figuring out what the big priorities were and how can we use that to guide our research. Okay, I'm going to kind of take the next couple of slides here to just give you a high level view of what people were thinking about across those 549 ideas and those 3 workshop types, and give you a sense of kind of some summaries of the information that we got before I kind of turn it over to Bobby here. So the first thing we can do is just look at a word cloud, right? So this is a word cloud of all of the text anybody generated at any of those workshops, right? A lot of work to kind of put this together. And sanity check, if you ask people, what do you think about fish and aquatic plants? They say fish and they say plants really often. So that's good. That means they're understood our questions, right? But you can also see other things start to pop out here, right? So for example, species. We had a lot of questions about specific species or interactions between specific species. Water quality was another one that came up pretty often. AIS is another one that came up pretty often. Communities, for example, so native and invasive communities were questions that came up pretty often. So you can start to see kind of a few different main topics that kind of were rising to the surface across all these different ideas that people offered. So as we got into this a little bit more, we realized we could kind of put all these different possible responses, every sticky note, for example, into 1 or 2 of about 12 buckets, right? And these are the kind of buckets here on the right-hand side of the screen that we ended up kind of generating for each possible response. So each possible response could get listed as falling into one or multiple of these possible buckets. Just kind of step through them quickly. Aquatic invasive species, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. Climate change, fisheries and food webs. So this is questions about, do plants host aquatic invertebrates that are important for food for fish, for example. Water quality, algae blooms, for example. Water clarity came up a lot. Human dimensions. So this actually fell into how people use the lake. So this is a wake boat, for example. Wake boats came up pretty often. And also, how do we learn more about how do we do the actual management, like outreach and kind of education questions, I think fell into this bucket. Plant-fish interactions, again, those species-specific interactions were very popular and came up very often. A couple different aspects of the plants themselves, so questions about plant density, in other words, how many plants are out there, and also plant diversity, how many species are out there, how many different growth forms are there. And then finally, lots of questions about treatments. So that'd be herbicides, mechanical treatments, et cetera. And then finally, shoreline development was another one. So again, this question about how people are using the lake and changing the lake and how that influences both plants and fish. So we kind of, again, tried to categorize all those 549 responses into 1 or 2 or 3 of these 12 possible categories, just so we could kind of see what the distribution of these different categories were across some different axes. So after we did that, we found one thing that was interesting. The ideas actually differed quite a bit among workshops. So here, this is all of our kind of 12 buckets again. And the height is how often they each came up in each workshop. So again, local decision maker, that's your kind of lake associations, state agencies, and then tribal agencies. Everybody talked about plant-fish interactions a lot, but then kind of below that, there's some interesting variation. So for example, lake associations, very interested in outreach. And how do we do outreach and education about plants and fish and human dimensions as well. Practitioners were very interested in things like treatments and plant density and plant community ideas. And the tribes were relatively more interested in aquatic invasive species and also a little bit more interested in climate change issues. So this is not to kind of pigeonhole each of these categories and say, well, this is what the tribes think and this is what the agencies think. But this, I think, is a good demonstration of how you have the same kind of topics with different people, you end up having different conversations, and you can see kind of differences in the distribution of concerns across different groups of people. And the other thing I want to point out is that the ideas are all very interconnected. I think we already kind of started to hint at this with the word cloud and some other things. But this, This is a pretty cool plot. It always reminds me of like a nautilus or a snail or something. The idea here, this is each word. This is essentially kind of a different version of a word cloud. This is a word. And this is the kind of bucket that word was mentioned within across all the different times it came up, right? And I show this to show again, species by far kind of the most mentioned word. But all of these were mentioned within a whole bunch of different buckets, right? There is no kind of single color wedge in this plot. Even AIS, which has its own topic, and it was mentioned in that topic very often, was also mentioned with reference to things like fisheries management, plant communities, water quality, or plant density, for example, right? So very rarely did we get a response or an idea that was one single topic. Often they're highly interconnected across lots of different topics. People are thinking very holistically about the different kind of issues and concerns they had. The other thing I'll point out and just kind of highlight, this is like a network plot of those responses again. So these are different buckets, a little bit more simplified. The size of the dot is how often that particular bucket was mentioned. And then the thickness of the connection is how often this bucket was mentioned with reference or in connection to another one, for example. And I just kind of like to point out that plant-fish interactions, again, those species-specific, I think bass are related to pondweed or whatever, type questions were very, very prevalent. And they're very strongly linked to questions about plant traits. So what is it about plant traits that drive these plant-fish interactions is something that came up very often. And again, just highlighting how often these species-specific concerns came up. What is the most important plant species for this fish species? Those types of questions. So what did we learn? The highest priority questions were related to associations between specific plants and specific fish species. So what drives bass abundance? How important is this plant for walleye or muskie or whatever? So I think there's a lot of concern and questions about, what are the specific plant species we need to be thinking about if we're thinking about managing for a particular set of fish species? And identifying those connections is going to be really important for developing what this toolbox look like. The second thing is that there's a clear desire out there for outreach and education. We had a lot of questions about, well, I just want to know more about my lake. I want to have this information available to me. Where can I get this information? Where can I get the information I need to make decisions? Some states are moving toward that. For example, this is the WDNR's Aquatic Plant Explorer, which is a really cool kind of online app that allows you to pull up a lake and get all those point intercept survey data. I think there's more that we could do here in terms of allowing folks to put their lakes in context with other lakes in terms of their plant and their fish communities and the relative performance of each. And the last thing is there are a lot of concerns about the effects of mechanical and chemical control in lakes, both on the fish side, but also on the plant side. Are we doing, are these causing issues with fish recruitment? Are they causing issues with native plant abundances? That I think are still open questions that we could continue to look at. What do we learn overall about holding these workshops? I like to add this in because I proposals like, yep, we'll do some workshops. It'll be fine. We'll talk to folks and get some information. It'll be great. It ended up the whole first year of this project was designing and executing these workshops. We spent a ton of time figuring out the best ways to ask our questions, to get this information, to build these virtual platforms, for example. What we found is that a good workshop takes a ton of time and planning. If you want to get a really good information, you have to put the work in at the front end to make sure you're asking the right questions and giving people the right spaces to think about the questions. The second thing we learned, don't schedule them during field season. We held one of our workshops pretty close to ice off, as was when a lot of our fish folks have to go out and start sampling. That one didn't have amazing attendance, and that was our fault, right? So thinking about other people's schedules and what they're going to be out doing and their availability is really important. Participant engagement and communication is really important. So we did a lot of front-end engagement, trying to give people a little bit of pre-work, but also just connecting with them about this project to get them engaged and get them ready to come into the workshop and to contribute, and also allowing them to contribute in different ways. Maybe folks just wanted to write out sticky notes and not talk. Maybe other people wanted to talk. Having multiple modes there was really useful. And the third thing is just want to highlight Miro again. Like, these virtual platforms can be really powerful. What we found is, this by building this platform, and now it's just there, and we have all the information right there we can refer back to, allowed us to create a really engaging online workshop, which I said sometimes those online workshops can be kind of hard to do. But this one I think was engaged, and people seem to stay engaged throughout. And I think it's because we did the work with this Miro platform to facilitate that. So where do we go from here? Now that we have our kind of questions, we've identified two. So we're kind of here. Actually, you could probably swing that arrow back down here closer to data and analyzing data now. But in a lot of ways, we're still getting these data together and starting to analyze data and answer questions. For this first set of the project, we've identified two main questions. The first one, are plants important for walleye recruitment, which we'll be hearing about in a minute. And the second one, are there associations between specific plant species or traits and fish species? So again, getting back to those specific species-specific issues are things we definitely want to try and address as part of this project, because we think not only they're the most important, but could also be most useful in terms of developing that, again, that habitat toolbox. So for future work, we're going to continue to try and make this a really living and accessible data set. We want to create this sandbox that allows other people to play in it. And I think being able to share those data could be really powerful in terms of getting a lot of those other questions answered, right? 549 questions, that's somebody's whole career. So I think there's a lot of possibilities as we continue to develop this data set. And the other thing is thinking about expansion. Right now, we're looking mainly in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and a little bit of Michigan. But if there's other data out there from other states, and if you're out there listening, I think there's going to be opportunities to continue to grow the footprint of this data set and really do some cool kind of landscape-wide, region-wide analysis as we get larger gradients of lake type and plant community type and fish community type. So with that, I am going to wrap up, and I just want to highlight, the next thing we talked about is the first phase of this analysis, and it's asking questions about how plants are important for walleye recruitment. So with that, I will turn it over to Bobby, and he is going to tell you a little bit about plants and walleye.
Okay, Zach, can you see my screen?
Looks good.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so as Zach said, I'm kind of like the postdoc on this project, so I'm kind of working through some of those steps that Zach mentioned in his talk. The second half of this will focus on a question related to like how plants and walleye are interacting in lakes in Minnesota and Wisconsin. All right, so stop me if you've seen this figure before or if you've heard this before. Walleye recruitment has been on the decline. We know sometime in like the late 90s, mid 90s, that we saw these pretty steep declines in walleye recruitment. This black line on this graph is natural recruitment. So those are lakes that are kind of supporting themselves. And we haven't seen that come back. So we know there's something going on in our lakes that's causing natural recruitment to decline. And then in service of that, we've done a lot of research. And in the last decade, if we use this paper here by Dr. Gretchen Hansen at University of Minnesota as kind of a landmark, it was published in 2015, we've studied a lot of factors and different data sets and different places to try to understand what is going on with walleye recruitment. And a couple of themes have emerged out of that research. The first is that there's probably something going on with climate and climate change, where these lakes may be transitioning out of a state that's like suitable for walleye, and climate variability is making harder for them to have good year classes. We know in some cases the populations themselves are a part of the situation where things like depensation or maternal effects, so the types and how many females you have in the population can play a role in how well that population can recruit. We know that the lakes themselves are kind of important, so how big the lake is, how complex the shoreline is, how much woody habitat is there. And we also think that there's these biological interactions going on with the fish community, whether that be with prey items like perch or interspecific competition with species like largemouth bass. So this is a really complex issue. And we spent a lot of time, as I just showed you, over the last decade, trying to figure out what is going on here. All of these studies, though, have missed a pretty big component of the natural environment that walleye are found in lakes. in that none of them really seek to evaluate the influence of aquatic macrophytes on walleye or walleye recruitment in general. And just to kind of illustrate this, there's been 3 reviews that have come out in the last 5 years. So these are like kind of the culmination of our understanding of the science on the topic at a given time. So we've had 3 of these papers come out looking at habitat and recruitment and kind of like the walleye issue in general. And even those reviews don't really have much information on macrophytes. There's a pretty big gap in our knowledge. And why might we think macrophytes are important to walleye? Well, we know that they can influence fish community dynamics by influencing predator-prey interactions. They simultaneously serve as shelter for small fish and hunting grounds for them as well. They feed on the plants themselves and plankton and macroinvertebrates that are found in those plants, but they also provide shelter from predation for those smaller fish. And this can actually influence size structure. So there's been work done to show where if you, say, remove some plants from a lake, you can improve the size structure and growth of your bigger fish. And in other cases, you don't see that kind of pronounced effect, but it has been documented before. And with walleye specifically, we know that walleye rely on the littoral zone in their first summer. So walleye are hatched out, they become kind of dispersed into the water column, and they feed on plankton. And as they become bigger and more piscivorous, they tend to swim back into the shoreline and become demersal, meaning they hang out kind of on the bottom. And we know that there is this period at some point in their first summer where a particular year class either makes it or doesn't, for the most part. So we know that this first summer can really determine the success or failure of a specific year class of fish. So with that in mind, this specific part of the project, we wanted to determine if the influence of aquatic macrophytes, if there was an influence of aquatic macrophytes on walleye recruitment, and to measure of that success or influence would be survival to the first fall. So both in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where we got our data from, they electrofish lakes in the fall to measure walleye recruitment. So how many of those age zeros or fish that were born in that spring survived to that first fall. And then second, if we do find some relationship, what aspects of aquatic macrophytes are important? So again, as I mentioned, we kind of took data from different houses inside the state agencies for this. So to get our measure of fish recruitment or walleye recruitment, we've used age zero CPE or catch per effort. So like a rate, basically, how many do we get per a certain amount of time in fall recruitment surveys. As Zach mentioned earlier, the DNR in both of these states uses what's known as like a point intercept survey to describe lake communities. So they go out and they basically lay an imaginary grid over a lake and they sample points at each one of those grid points. They capture not only how much or what kinds of plants are there, but how much of them are there. And then we can use that to calculate some derived metrics. What we end up with is a data set that looks like this across the landscape. So our data set in Wisconsin was in the ceded territory. In Minnesota, we had data from most of the spread out throughout the state, but we're looking at the years 2004 to 2021. We had 199 lakes, mostly in Wisconsin, 164 in Wisconsin, 35 in Minnesota. Altogether, we had 360 lake years. So some of these lakes had multiple years where they had data that was suitable for our study. So they may have 4 or 5 different year observations in the data set. So we ended up using a random forest model, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. But essentially what we did was we took a bunch of variables. These environmental variables over here are all kind of known to have some influence on walleye and walleye recruitment. The only one that we added here was littoral area. So how much of your lake is littoral? And we define that based on where the plants are found. But these variables have all been shown in research previously to some extent to have some influence on recruitment. And we added these three variables that are related to plants. So the first is littoral vegetation percentage. So how much of your littoral area is covered in plants? Taxa richness, so how many different types of plants do you have in your lake? And then conservatism is a measure of how sensitive plants are. So it gives us an idea of kind of the quality of the plants in the lake as well. So as I mentioned, we used a random forest model. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but basically it's a way, it's a machine learning algorithm, if you've heard that phrase before, but it can handle messy data. So we can kind of be lax with the assumptions in the data. It makes it more flexible for us to use. And one of the reasons I like a random forest, and I'll show you a plot later, where it can actually tell us which variables are more important than others and which ones are not in the data that we have. In order to use the data from the two states, we did a data transformation. So we're going to use, you're going to see percentile on my graphs instead of raw CPE values. Again, that stands for catch per effort. So that's how many fish they catch in a given amount of time. And this, I think, improves interpretability and makes it easy to combine both states. So what we have here is the density of like the raw values in Wisconsin, and that dashed line is where sorry. Yeah, so we transform them to raw CPEs. And then later on, I will also be talking about successful and failed year classes. And this criteria is based on a number that the DNR uses, Wisconsin DNR uses, which is 10 fish per mile. So if they find 10 walleye per mile in their fall electrofishing surveys, they consider that a successful year class. That's a year class where we expect to see adults in 2 or 3 years in sampling in the adults. So that particular cutoff is this vertical dash line on this graph. Okay, so jumping into kind of like what the model tells us. Again, we put all this data into a model. What does it tell us? Well, first off, I want to say that our model explained 30% of the variation in the data, which might sound low, but is actually a really good number for walleye if you go looking at other studies. And it tells us that vegetated littoral area, or how much of your littoral area has macrophytes in it, was a really important variable. In fact, it was the most important. And when we look at the relationship, so these next couple of plots that look like this one in particular are called partial dependence plots. Essentially, they tell us, like, given all the data that we have in this model, how does this one variable vary over the range of a predictor variable? So on the x-axis here, we have vegetated littoral area. So you can see that goes from 0 to 1. So this is no vegetation. On the far left here would be no vegetation in the lake at all. And on the far right at 1, that would be 100% of your littoral area is covered in vegetation. And on the y-axis, we have walleye CPE percentile. So this 0.5 here would be the 50th percentile. So that's exactly in the middle. Anything above that number is above average. Anything below that number is below average. On this particular type of plot, we're really interested in the trend. So how does the model think that walleye CPE percentile should vary over vegetated littoral area, over the gradient that we have in our data? So what we see is this pretty stark pattern where in lakes with less than 50% littoral vegetation, we see that we have relatively high predicted walleye CPEs. And in lakes that have above 50% vegetation, we have relatively low walleye CPEs. And so that kind of was like an eye opener for us. And we said, like, hey, what's going on here? So we took a deeper look at this. So again, I mentioned earlier that we classified lake years, walleye recruitment in a given year in a given lake as either a success or failure based on that DNR cutoff that they use. When we look at the distribution of those, so this plot here is a density plot. It kind of tells us where the most where the data occurs. So these peaks are the most prevalent, where the highest frequency of values occur for this particular variable. So what you can see here is that our failures, we have a pretty high frequency above the median, the 50th percentile, whereas successes are much more spread out, but that peak is right around 40 to 50%. So we're seeing this difference in whether or not a year class is successful or not successful based on how much littoral vegetated area there is. We can look at the probability of having a successful year class. So this is a logistic regression. On the y-axis, we have probability. So a 1 would be a successful year class, a 0 would be a not successful year class, and anything in between that is the probability. So roughly halfway between those two would suggest you have a 50% probability of having a successful year class. So what we see is that our predicted probability of success declines as you increase vegetation in the littoral area. And the real reason for that is, so these are the values that kind of went into this model. So you can see the walleye percentiles here across all our lakes, and they're color-coded by success or failures. Is as we increase, especially above this 50th percentile, we start to see a higher prevalence of values that are true zeros. So these values down here in this red bubble are values where the survey found no young of year walleye in that particular survey. So when our littoral vegetation gets really high, we have a higher chance of not having any recruitment at all. So if we go back to our variable importance plot, again, we just kind of looked at vegetated littoral area. What else is important? What else do we see? We see that lake area is important, and lake area kind of has this plateau, predicted plateau effect, where in really small lakes, we see this really strong gradient of predicted walleye recruitment. And then as we get bigger, that kind of flattens out. And then as your lake increases in littoral area, so as the overall area of your lake becomes more shallow, we see this pretty steady decrease in predicted walleye recruitment percentile. So those two things together tell us that in bigger lakes, we should expect to have higher walleye recruitment, which you already knew. And in this particular instance, we also see that in lakes that tend to be more littoral, we should also see a decrease in predicted walleye recruitment. One of the other more powerful things about random forest is we can look at how these variables kind of interact with each other. So I spent a lot of time looking through, that was a list of 12 or 13 predictor variables, and seeing are there any kind of understandable, meaningful interactions here. One of the ones that came out right away was this interaction between growing degree days and vegetated area in your littoral zone, or littoral vegetation. So growing degree days, if you've never seen this before, it actually comes from agriculture, but it's basically a measure of how warm a lake is. So lakes that have higher numbers tend to be warmer on average over the course of a year, and lakes with lower numbers tend to be cooler. What we have plotted is the color, or the kind of heat map is showing us where we would expect to have predicted high recruitment and predicted low recruitment. What we end up with is this kind of interesting quadrat map where the best case scenario is kind of this lower left quadrant, where we have cooler lakes with relatively low amounts of littoral vegetation. And then on the exact opposite, in warm lakes with a lot of vegetation, we expect walleye recruitment to not be so good. And again, just kind of going back and looking at the raw data. So if we take those same cutoffs and kind of plot the data that's going into them, behind them, what we see is in that lower lower left quadrant, 60% of our lake year observations there are considered successes based on our metric. So again, when we have cooler lakes with less littoral vegetation, we tend to see pretty reliable recruitment. When we look at our other quadrants, we can see that we have much lower recruitment. So in this upper left quadrant, even though we have cool lakes, which we know are important for walleye as a cool water species, if we have a lot of littoral vegetation, we're still not really expecting, or we're not seeing a lot of recruitment success. And over here, when we have warm lakes, regardless of whether we have a lot of vegetation or not, we're also not seeing high rates of successful year classes. So just some other interactions that came out in this particular model that I wanted to show you. I talked about that decline in littoral area, and this is littoral vegetation. So we have two interactions here with littoral area. When you look at how it relates to vegetation, when you have a small lake, or excuse me, when you have a relatively less vegetated lake, so below that median value, we see a pretty weak gradient here with walleye recruitment. So even in lakes that have a lot of littoral area, if there's less vegetation, the model is predicting that we would have good recruitment or relatively higher recruitment. And then when you get above that median percentile, you see a stronger gradient here in littoral vegetation. And then kind of looking at lake area and lake littoral area. So your best case scenario, when you have a small lake, so less than 1,000 hectares, we'll say, is to have it be mostly not littoral. So if it's less than 50% littoral, we can expect to see relatively, the model's predicting that we should have relatively good recruitment. What I really want to pull out on the graph on the right is that when you get to bigger lakes, so above that 1,000-hectare mark, what you actually see is a weaker gradient. So these smaller lakes go from bright yellow to dark purple, which is basically the full range of values that we see here. But when we go above that 1,000 hectares roughly mark, we see that gradient is not as strong. So there's some kind of like that effect of littoral area is being mediated by lake size. So if you're on a bigger lake, you can still have a relatively high amount of littoral area. The model is predicting that you might have some better recruitment there. So I know I'm like 10, 15 minutes in my talk here, and I really haven't talked much about individual plant species or communities. And we know there's differences in these lakes with their plant communities. Some are more moss dominated. Some might have more submersed plants like coontail. Some might have these isoded meadows, which are these small plants that grow on the bottom and don't really occupy much of the water column. Some might have a lot of floating plants, or some might have some stiffer submersed plants like carassids. So we know there's these differences that exist, and intuitively, it might make sense that that would impact how all this works. But what we found when we started looking at these questions is that, at least with the data that we have, we don't really see these strong differences in the plant communities affecting walleye recruitment. So what I'm showing here is a ordination plot. Basically, what we're doing here is you can take the plant community and boil it down into 2 dimensions. So I'm taking, say, 50 or 60 plant species and asking the model or the analysis to explain to me how these 50 or 60 species relate to each other in a way that my brain can understand. So in this particular plot, 2 points that are closer to each other, that implies that their plant community is closer to each other. And what we would see if we thought that there was something driving these recruitment differences in walleye with the plants is that there should be some kind of like clustering. So we should see maybe all the successes pulled off to one side, all the failures pulled off to the other. But we don't really see that. What we see is this kind of shotgun blast where they're all mixed together. So what that tells us is there's not really strong patterns in the plant communities. They're definitely not really clustering around whether or not walleye recruitment is successful in these lakes. So with all that said, my takeaway message here is really what my analysis is saying is if you have a small, shallow, weedy lake, it might not be the best walleye lake. And I know that there are exceptions to that, but that's kind of our general understanding of walleye biology anyways. And now we have an analysis that's suggesting that, hey, when you have a shallow, weedy lake, it might not be the best place for walleye recruitment. So what does all this mean? To me, this means that littoral vegetation is likely another hurdle in walleye recruitment. So we know that walleye have these like vast fluctuations in recruitment year over year, where some lakes, it might take 2 or 3 years before we see year classes um, it might be 2 or 3 years in between year classes that stick and show up in our surveys later and end up in the fishery so that you can catch them. And we know there's a bunch of things that can influence that, whether it's ice phenology, so whether or not the ice off is timed roughly when the walleye are ready to spawn, spring climate, so how variable the spring climate is, and mismatches with whether or not plankton, their food sources, are ready or not. So all these things can kind of mess up walleye recruitment. And I think that maybe littoral vegetation is another thing that could be a possible roadblock for them. And the reason for that is what we found was like that, as littoral vegetation increases, we're seeing less successful recruitment. That may be a foraging efficiency problem. So walleye are very visual predators, even when they're small. And if they're in dense weed mats, it might be hard for them to effectively forage. The other possibility is what I'm coining the bass phenomenon. So we've done a lot of work to show that bass, we've done a lot of work to try to understand like interspecific interactions in the fish community. And there's several analyses that show like this antagonistic relationship between walleye and bass. And no matter how hard we try, we really haven't found a direct link between the two. We think that maybe this littoral vegetation thing could be something similar, where littoral vegetation is essentially a signal for a lake that might not be great for walleye, but maybe it's not the driver. We don't know that for sure. So thinking about management, are we going to be like Ripley here and just burn everything to the ground? My answer would be probably almost absolutely not. So I don't think that this study suggests that aggressive plant management is like a really great idea. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that there's a lot of unintended consequences to really aggressively trying to remove plants from a lake. One is that herbicides have been shown to be particularly, or walleye and perch are particularly vulnerable to herbicides that are commonly used for aquatic plant management, especially compared to other fish like some sharkids. So you could unintentionally be influencing recruitment that way. There's also research that shows that aquatic plants affect things like water quality and nutrient cycling. So there's a lot of like dominoes that might fall if you were to start really aggressively managing plants. The other thing I want to point out, this was pointed out to me by one of my co-authors. They said, like, I was making a pretty big deal about this distribution of failed year classes, but they said to me, hey, look at the successful year classes. And what you see is the peak or the most frequent occurrences of successful year classes occurs at roughly 50% littoral vegetation. So even our data is actually suggesting that maybe a moderate level of plant vegetation is the best for walleye. And then the other thing I've already mentioned is that lakes that are even considered to have reliable recruitment still have large fluctuations year over year in the amount of walleye, age 0 walleye that end up making it to the fall. One example that we see a lot in the literature is Escanaba Lake, where the Wisconsin TNR does a lot of their work. Even that lake, which is considered, it's one of the most studied walleye lakes in the world, honestly, there's still these big fluctuations in how much recruitment occurs each year. Where I think this study will be particularly useful is in a RAD concept, that's resist, accept, direct. So thinking about how to adapt to climate change and changing environments. In that context, thinking about the littoral vegetation and what that's like in a lake could influence walleye management. And then to kind of taking that resist strategy and thinking about it a little more, if you're stocking walleye in your lake, or if you're a state agency and you have 2 lakes that could be stocked and you only have enough resources to stock one, maybe thinking about littoral vegetation could be a kind of like tiebreaker in that scenario. So I want to close on this slide. I think this is really important. It's something that's come out in the process of like writing this paper. I want to reiterate, we really don't actually know what the relationship is between aquatic plants and walleye. This study is observational, which means that we didn't manipulate anything. We can't actually say that X is causing Y. In this case, we can't say littoral vegetation is causing failed walleye recruitment. So what we really need is direct manipulation or experiments. Kind of in that vein, one example that we do have is the Chippewa flowage, where they're doing drawdowns to help manage Eurasian milfoil. We're seeing walleye recruitment kind of a return in some extent there. So that's a positive sign, but the Chippewa flowage isn't a really great example. It's a big system. It's a flowage, so it's also got loadic systems attached to it where walleye could spawn in. And it's not really intended to be monitored in this way. Kind of on that, piggybacking off of that, targeted long-term monitoring where we're taking specific lakes and measuring the aquatic plant community and the fish community over a period of time would help us better understand what is going on here. And then, as Zach mentioned in his talk, the DNR does a great job collecting data for aquatic plants. I think since the early 2000s, there's over 2,000 surveys in Wisconsin alone on aquatic plants. And they do a pretty good job of measuring walleye recruitment too. In Wisconsin, we have over 1,000 walleye recruitment surveys going back into the 90s. And so, like, we have a lot of data, but they don't overlap a ton. And so it's been kind of a challenge to put these two data sets together, and being a little more strategic about how we use those resources would really strengthen our understanding of how these two parts of the aquatic community and lakes affect each other. This is my announcement slide. Zach already hit most of these, but I'm just going to leave them up here for a minute. Again, I've had some really great partners who've helped me along the way. I don't really know much about plants, so I would like to shout out my plant people, specifically Katie Hine and Eric Elgin and Jeremy Harstock and Mike Verhoeven in helping me with this project. And with that, I'm going to, I guess, turn the talk back over to Joe, since I'm finished, and let him take it from there.
Great. Well, thanks, Bobby and Zach. So much information and really, really fascinating stuff. It's a little past 3 my time, but I think we have a few minutes we can ask questions from the audience if folks have them. So I'll remind folks if you have questions to go ahead and use the Q&A button to submit them. I understand there are 549 questions waiting for you guys already, so uh, we'll try to get through a few of them, but I know that we're not going to be able to answer all of the questions facing you guys. Um, the first question that I wanted to ask was about catch rates in walleye and vegetation. So, have you considered if decreased catch rates in lakes with more vegetated littoral areas might be increasing the difficulty of seeing and netting them? And so, what we're seeing is an observation error in walleye presence, not necessarily process the walleye abundance.
Yep. We've considered this pretty thoroughly, actually. So there's two things I'd like to mention. The first is that I am willing to accept that yes, catch rates are probably lower in denser vegetation. However, what is really driving that relationship is those propensities of zeros at higher vegetation. I don't think that totally explains why we would see zeros. The second thing is, I put up that image of that really weedy lake. What our data shows in the background is that a lot of our lakes are probably not that weedy. So the Wisconsin DNR uses a subjective scale when they do their plant surveys of a 1, a 2, or a 3. The 3 being like this lake is completely full until you can picture like a lake that would have like really dense, heavy vegetation. What we see is even up to like 100% littoral vegetation, majority of our lakes are ones or twos. So there's either light vegetation or moderate vegetation. So even yes, there are lakes that have very thick, dense, weedy vegetation, but not all of our lakes are like that. And then the last thing I'll say about this is we actually went back after we got some feedback about this and analyzed the same relationship in adults. So we asked in Wisconsin, we used age 5 PEs, population estimates, and in Minnesota, we used age 3 gillnet CPEs to look at if adult abundance varied in the same way with littoral vegetation. And even in the adults, we're still picking up this signal. So there's decreasing abundance at higher littoral vegetation, and there's a significant logistic relationship as well. So that tells me that maybe this isn't about sampling efficiency.
All right. And Zach, feel free to jump in if you have additional thoughts.
No, Bobby nailed that one. Yeah, we spent a lot of time making sure that the signal seemed like a real one, and yeah, it does seem to be something there to it.
Is it possible that stocked walleye are dragging down recruitment either through being stocked in lakes where they don't belong or genetically swamping or polluting the native stocks?
So I didn't explicitly say this, and that's my fault. In Wisconsin, we only used lakes that were natural recruitment. In Minnesota, we allowed for fry stocking also, but not fingerling stocking. So essentially, all of our lakes are either natural recruitment or only fry stocked. So that wouldn't really be an issue in this case.
Interesting. Another question, have you tried using autonomous underwater vehicles for surveying aquatic vegetation and comparing that to raking or other more traditional methods?
Yeah, does anybody out there want to buy us one? That'd be great. No, so we have talked about it. I think Minnesota might have one. I know they're out there, and we have talked about different ways to survey aquatic plants. I know people also do things like hydroacoustics, and you can get things like bioplant biomass as well. So there are other ways people survey plants in these point intercept surveys. However, the point intercept surveys are really great because you get like very precise kind of species identifications. Um, but yeah, I think it's an interesting question, something to keep thinking about. What's the best way to actually measure some of these plant variables?
All right, we have tons of questions, and I don't know that we're going to be able to get to them all, but we'll do a few more here. How are you accounting for the vast differences in vegetation sample number between lakes, given that the frequency is dependent on sample number?
Can you say the second part of that question again, Joe?
Yeah, given that the frequency of occurrence is dependent on sample number. I can read the whole thing again. How are you
Uh,
accounting for vast differences in vegetation sample number between lakes, given that the frequency of occurrence is dependent on the sample number?
well, the DNR accounts for that by in Wisconsin, they lay out like this. They have like an algorithm that calculates the number of points they need in each lake. So yeah, bigger lakes get more points, but it's kind of the same proportionally to their size.
Okay. Um, did you guys look into any particular species? So one person asked about starry stonewort and walleye. I imagine others have invasive species, of other flavors in their minds. Did you guys do any species specific relationships?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So what we did was again the when we looked at like the whole communities, we didn't really see anything that was really concrete. So I did go back and I tried to find the species that were most correlated to walleye recruitment. And what we see is this kind of general pattern where uh, it's mostly species that have a high correlation to walleye recruitment are generally species that occur in the water column and tend to form kind of like mats, like milfoil is one, uh, coontail is another, some of the pond weeds. But uh, it's not really clean and cut and dry. Uh, what we see is this like filtering effect, where as the frequency of occurrence, as these plants become more abundant in the littoral area, we tend to see a filtering out of higher percentiles. So on the left side of those graphs, it would be like a big blob, and then as the as we go to higher occurrences of those plants, the blob tends to kind of dissipate. So it's not really anything that we could say like a concrete pattern. I had one more thought. I can't remember. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean the general. So like Bobby said, we did look at that, but like all the different ways we've kind of sliced the plant data, it kept coming back to the higher proportion of littoral zone vegetated, lower walleye
Yep.
recruitment.
There was
Um,
also earlier versions of the model that had a community type variable. So the DNR has this classification system in Wisconsin, and we assigned all the lakes in our study to that system, and we didn't really see differences there.
Cool. We have a number of folks saying kind of thank you and echoing the real value of this project and the research that you've presented today, but also some of the research questions that you're taking on and
Oh,
the general need for this research. So, I think
I
on
don't want
behalf of
to
all of them, thank you.
I don't want to interrupt, but what I was going to say, I remember now. I did specifically also look at Eurasian milfoil and the frequency of successes and failures with lakes that did or did not have Eurasian milfoil. And it is slightly higher in lakes that have it. So failure, the ratio, there's a lower percentage of success in lakes with milfoil, but it wasn't statistically different. So again, like there there might be something there, but nothing concrete that we can actually say something about.
One of the things you mentioned was on the Chippewa flowage,
Mhm,
repeated sampling. Do you have
mhm.
any other instances in your data sets of repeated sampling of the same lake that would allow you to look at within lake variation? I mean, the ideal case would be you'd have some sort of unintentional before after control impact that
Yeah,
you
I
stumbled upon.
I wish. No, we actually just recently really tried to look at this, and less than five lakes in the data set have more than five observations. And part of that is the way that the DNR does walleye sampling. So they only do it every couple years. And then if a lake happened to have a plant survey that year, then, it was there. Uh, at one point, I did look at outside of just the lakes in our study system. And one example that does have a lot of overlap is Kentuck Lake, but Kentuck Lake is a mess. I don't know if you know anything about Kentuck Lake, but it's got aquatic invasives, it's got rusty crayfish, it gets stocked, it's had other like habitat restoration. So it's not really a great example. Uh, to do like a quasi like before after control impact.
yeah, that'd be in a perfect world we would have data like that, but the
Mhm.
way the walleye populations are surveyed on rotation, and then the way the plant populations are also sporadically surveyed, you don't get a lot of like really clean time series. And the places that we did find it weren't very representative. So those handful of lakes tended to be lakes with high vegetation. So those might have been lakes that had got a lot of plant attention because maybe there's treatments or other things going on there. So it's also not like a representative sample of the different lake types in the data set. Yeah, totally agree. I think that would be the next interesting next question is thinking about some of this stuff a little bit more experimentally, so you actually try and see some of these effects or what the mechanisms are.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Um, I think we are sort of wrapping up on most of the big questions. There still are a number of open questions out there, but I don't know that we're going to be able to get to them all in the interest of time here. So at this point, I want to say thank you to you guys both for the research that you have done and continue to do. I think it's just really interesting and helps us. I think aquatic vegetation management is one of the major levers that we have as lake managers, and that we see being pulled. And so it's really helpful to have a better understanding of what its potential effects are. Um, and I will, for those of you that are interested in aquatic vegetation management and walleye, I will flag that our presentation last week by Logan Cutler from on a excuse me, he's a Wisconsin DNR biologist, but it was on a South Dakota lake, was pointing to heavy walleye use in these South Dakota glacial lakes of vegetated bays that were um, the fish were using for major parts of the year at the adult stage anyway. So really interesting, kind of side by side juxtapositions of two different scientific approaches and two different potential conclusions coming from things. And as always, I think the message with walleye is a complex one, and so lots of considerations to take into account here as we move forward with aquatic vegetation management and walleye. So with that, we will wrap up. A reminder: will be recorded, and we'll share this webinar about a week from now on our YouTube channel, and all the registrants will get an email saying that that's been posted. We have our final webinar of the spring this next week, so Tuesday, same time next week. Isan Gane is presenting on the legacy phosphorus problem, solutions for protecting inland lakes, and there's going to be a lot of conversation about conservation drainage and drain tiles and what those effects are on nutrients in lakes and how those nutrient issues might be resolved through different drainage techniques. So, a topic moving away from the plants and more toward the watershed. Um, all good stuff. So with that, we're going to wrap up. I want to say thank you again to our presenters and to those of you that attended. In the interim, thank you for all you do for lakes, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone.